We good? Have we been live at all?
On Facebook and Twitter, yeah.
Great. Okay, cool. So, back to the introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce Caitlin Shepherd. Caitlin is joining us via the magic of the internet and will appear around here very shortly. Today she's going to share some of the research and findings from her practice and research PhD, Caring to Listen, which focuses in on how working class experiences are often excluded from socially engaged art. Caitlin is an artist, researcher and educator, and she uses print design, sound installations and built structures to explore and listen to personal stories of everyday life, with a particular interest in lived experiences of class identity, precarity and intersectional economic inequality. So please give a warm online and hopefully in the building welcome to Caitlin.
Hello everyone, thank you for that, Luke, and you're smashing it. I can't imagine what it's like to be suddenly offline and into the sort of physical, immediate temporal realities. So hi everyone, and thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. A bit about where I'm calling from. I'm currently in a chalet in a holiday park in Cornwall. So if anything goes wrong, it's because either the electricity meter has run out of money, but I have topped it up, or the internet crashes. So hopefully we're going to be fine. Okay, so I've just put my timer on. How I'm going to do this is I've written a bit of a script because there's quite a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that I cover everything. I think it takes about 30 minutes, maybe a bit under. And then I hope there'll be space for questions and discussion about this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to start. And the other thing, Jade, if you could put my abstract in the Zoom chat now, that would be great. Or wherever's visible for our multi-streaming recipients. And the other thing, if I have a key terms document as well. So if anyone wants to ask questions about the terms I use, we can refer to that document later, and I can also share that later and put it on my website as well. And I'm going to be asking whoever's controlling the slides to change the slides, so hopefully that will work. And I'll just use the direction change slide, so we've got that sorted. Okay, so I'm working between screens, so excuse me if my eyes dart around a little bit, but that's what's going on my very makeshift desk here. So I'm going to start, and really the aim of this talk is to share with you what I've been working on over the last 6 years in terms of Caring to Listen, which is my practice-based PhD work, and talk about my practice and also talk about the reasons why I've undertaken this research and share what I found. So I'm going to start with a quote by artist Cassie Thornton, who's an artist I discuss quite a bit in my work and whose work I really like. So here's the quote. "We are asking each other questions about what hurts and where, and taking notes. What are we doing? We are interviewing each other about the conditions of our health, our lives, and what it's like to be us." Close quote. So I'm going to just start by locating myself very briefly. As Luke said, thanks Luke, I'm an artist, researcher and lecturer. In terms of my PhD, I'm based at the University of West of England at the Digital Cultures Research Centre, and I just handed in my thesis 3 weeks ago yesterday, and I'm still relishing that feeling. The Viva will be in January, so I'm going to talk about what I've been working on there. Alongside this, I work 0.6 as a lecturer in contextual and theoretical studies remotely at the moment at LCC in London, UAL. I'm a white cis woman from a single parent, low income working class background, family background. I consider myself to be a class hybrid in that I'm from a family that hasn't had and continues to not have a lot of money in terms of the money available to myself and my twin brother, but also I've had access to significant amounts of cultural and social capital, which I'll talk about later. I've also got the privilege and the security of having a 0.6 permanent job, and I do other paid work alongside this. So personally speaking, as a member of the kind of labour economy, I'm pretty stable, and I earn an above average salary if I was full-time equivalent. I pay rent for where I live. I live in a flat in mid Wales, and the flat is currently being turned into a housing co-op. So I live with 9 other adults and 5 other children, and we're figuring out how to turn our property into a property that's owned by a cooperative rather than that's owned by individuals. And I think that's all I want to say about my location and my situation. So next slide, please, whoever I'm speaking to. Thanks. So the background to Caring to Listen started out as a project interested in the effective agency of site-specific sound art installations and listening. And quite quickly, a year or so in, that started off in 2015, a long time ago it feels. So quite quickly, a year or so into my initial research, I carved my focus into an interest in gathering oral accounts, first-person stories of everyday lived experiences of home and housing. And I was interested in how audio recording, editing and narrowcasting these stories related to an enabling or a hindering of empathy and action on socioeconomic inequality, lived experiences of socioeconomic inequality. And I initially situated this question and this inquiry in the field of relational aesthetics, a term coined by Nicholas Bourriade, but I later ended up putting this question in the field of socially engaged art practice. I should say I'm also really interested in socially engaged and participatory design, but this research is situated within the broader field of socially engaged art. And at the start of this project, I felt somehow unable to focus on working class experience explicitly. I think my aversion to taking ownership of working class experiences as the sort of central focus of my research was compounded by various pushbacks that I experienced from collaborators, colleagues, and other people I was working with. I was often told, I felt that I was told that class wasn't an issue, it didn't exist, it wasn't important. And I later realised that these responses were sometimes, but not always, code for a resistance for other people working in the arts to acknowledge and therefore act on the very material and cultural realities of intersectional socioeconomic inequality and difference. And because of this sort of entwined lived and social experience of class being challenged on my kind of constant talking and thinking about class, I ended up reframing my research through what I felt was a more palatable framework, which was home and housing. So, you know, in the first few years of my research, I was focusing on listening to stories about home and housing, but really I realised that what I wanted to speak about explicitly was class experience in the context of the production of socially engaged artwork. I wasn't as interested in home as I was class, and I used home initially because I felt like it was more palatable and less controversial topic to explore the same issues. What money was available to earn, how much resource was available to individuals within that household or family, and indeed how did a class identity show up in the ways individuals felt confident to speak of their experience or able to speak of the reality of their experience, as well as having access to different types of cultural, social, and economic resource. So a quick thing I want to say before going on into my research in more detail is, problematically at present, there's still a pitting of white working class experience as in conflict with the aims of wider anti-racist social justice ambitions. And most recently, this has been expressed through stories that declare a cultural deficit of understanding of white working class experiences. And this has been seen in recent news stories earlier this year, reporting on working class status deficits, coming with academics warning of white working class feeling neglected, feeling overlooked by other social and racial justice issues. What I want to stress here is that in my discussion of class inequality in socially engaged art, is that race, gender and class must be discussed together, and they're forces that shape experiences of inclusion, exclusion, opportunity and barriers to success together. So I'm not interested in taking this position of privileging a research into white working class experience. In Caring to Listen, I'm not focusing on white working class artists. I recognise that class, gender and race lines intersect and create different experiences of privilege and inequality and oppression. And so I draw on the concept of intersectionality, and this is just very important for me to foreground because I don't want my research to be seen as fixating on white working class experience. Intersectionality, you've probably all heard of it. It's a term that was coined by scholar and lawyer activist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And it's a term that recognises that our own lived experiences and organisation of power are not shaped by a single axis of inequality, but are shaped by many compounded and coexisting axes of inequality and privilege. And as Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Burge note, quote, intersectionality as an analytic tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves, close quote. Next slide, please. Okay, so the aim of Caring to Listen, back to what am I doing, bit of what I'm doing, giving a bit of context. So the aim of Caring to Listen is to better understand the experiences of socioeconomic inequality amongst workers, artists in the field of socially engaged art in the UK. My focus is on economic inequality and the lack of people from working class backgrounds making it into producer, artist, commissioner and curator roles. And this desire to do this research is motivated by my own lived experience as someone coming from a single parent, low income family, engaged throughout my working life as an artist and educator and activist. I've done quite a lot of activist work. I sort of engaged in different types of labour to support myself and my family, and also to try and work for money and try and leave enough time to do my creative practice as well. Next slide, please. So the research question guiding my research, and I will come back to this question as I move through the presentation, is can listening practices help understand how class background shapes creative ideas and experiences of success when working as a socially engaged artist? So why, oh, next slide, please. So why am I undertaking this research? So I'm going to give three main reasons briefly. So firstly, it's vitally important, I think, to remain critical. Luke's t-shirt comes to mind there, critical, of the pervasiveness of Eurocentric patriarchal capitalism. It's important to do this because this system normalises banal and extreme forms of violence and forms of socioeconomic discipline and notions of success that are contingent on systemic exploitation of people, social values and ecosystems, to name a few. And this system, I think, rewards normative gender, sexuality and economic choices and punishes and disciplines anyone not conforming to those decisions. Secondly, Eurocentric patriarchal capitalist values are reproduced in the creative and cultural industries. A lot of research has shown this, and I can talk about this more later, or hopefully when we have a discussion. And thirdly, the conditions of labour within the creative industries have been exposed by recent research to be precarious and coming with significant hidden costs. It's these hidden costs that means it's not available for everyone to take the risks required to sort of make it in the creative and cultural industries. And these hidden costs include unpaid emotional, psychological and social care work. There's also the presence of validation gaps that sort of prevent people from getting professional support, career progression opportunities, and quite literally what it says, validation for the work that they're doing in this area. And thirdly, my research has found that looking into workforce diversity, who gets to make it as an artist, I'm interested in who gets to make it as a kind of creative producer in socially engaged art, has not yet been fully undertaken. And there are some reasons for this, which I'll talk about later. Next slide, please. It's nice to see you in the room. I can see the back of your heads. I've just been zoomed out, so this is great. Yay. Okay, so hopefully that's the methodology slide. Right, so how do I do this? How do I do this research? So broadly, my approach is to use a practice as research methodology, and in defining this, I draw on ideas offered by Robin Nelson in his multi-mode epistemological model for practices research. And I also draw on ideas put forward by academic and activist bell hooks. So what I like about Nelson's model is that he views academic and artistic practice as imbricated, and to define the imbrication of scholarly inquiry and artistic and creative and sort of practice-based inquiry, he uses the term praxis. He views theory and practice as entwined and inseparable, and I think that's really important in anyone who's doing artistic research. It's useful to see them as connected, not separate. And now, bell hooks is a really important teacher to me. I draw on her work a lot. But one of the key ideas that I incorporate into my approach, my methodology, is this idea of passion of experience. So Hooks acknowledges that the presence of suffering and inequality in the academy and wider society are legitimate sources of knowledge generation. So drawing on lived experiences of inequality and difference can be a valid site of coming up with new ideas and new insight. And she quotes that the experience of suffering can give rise to, quote, passion of experience, close quote, specific types of knowledge that arise from inequality and suffering. Next slide, please. So I've developed my own praxis research system, which I've named the Dynamic Praxis Research System. And really it builds on Nelson's ideas, but it kind of defines the 6 types of activity that I undertake to do this research. And these includes artistic activity and more traditional kind of primary and secondary source identification and data collection and analysis. And maybe there'll be some questions about this later, but I'm not going to read out the 6 points, but there is an imbricated system of connected processes that happen in fairly chaotic and concurrent ways. I really struggled to come up with a linear methodology. I felt like I was doing a lot of different things at once, and sometimes I was doing them in a particular order, and other times it just seemed that I was doing lots of things at once, and I was never quite sure how all these activities were making sense, but I knew that they were all happening at once and they sort of had to happen at once. So I wanted to design a system that kind of represented all of the activities I was doing as in flow, as interconnected and flowing in and out of each other. Next slide, please. So methods. I can't see what slides are on the big screen, but I'm just trusting that they get together, because I can just see a white screen at the front of the room. But if it isn't making sense, someone please shout. But we should be looking at an illustration of some research methods. So you're all seeing that? Yeah, okay. So the research methods that I've undertaken are a kind of primary, secondary and artistic practice. I've undertaken desk-based research, identifying, reading and analysing contemporary academic research into inequality within the creative and cultural industries, specifically the field of socially engaged art. And then I've also done primary research collection. So I've interviewed 30 audience members who attended and experienced the life of Presence Like the Air, one of the pieces I made as part of this project. And then I've also conducted ongoing critical self-reflection, which is part of Nelson's model of practices research, is sort of returning to critical interrogation of my methods, my ideas, my questions, and also thinking about my biases and what sort of situated experience and knowledge I bring to this project. And the other methods I've used to do this research is I have made new socially engaged artwork involving listening and caring practices. So I'm just going to briefly introduce my practice now. So next slide, please. It should be the convivial listening protocol image. So the convivial listening protocol is like the most recent piece of work I've been developing, and it's developed off the back of the other projects I've made as part of this work, which are Home and A Life of Presence Like the Air, that I'll talk about in a minute. And this listening protocol is essentially a do it with others workshop, activity, how-to guide, and it's intended for people to do it in pairs or groups. And it's a kind of set of instructions and prompts to engage with participatory listening with the aim of mapping. So inside this document, you open it and there's a map, an intersectional privilege and inequality map, and you work together using listening and conversational prompts to talk about your different experiences of privilege and inequality. So it's a bit of a toolkit to talk about class, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ableism, neurodiversity, and a lot of different intersecting experiences that we experience as individuals. And it came up because I was asking, how can I facilitate more listening together in the sort of through the research I've been doing, because my previous work is definitely listening led, but it hasn't been listening led on inviting people to give an account of themselves, to speak of your own experience together with others. My previous work was doing that a bit, but it wasn't doing that massively. So this most recent project is a work in progress. It's a printed publication, printed on a single sheet of newsprint, folded up into a cross-fold concertina, so it's really cheap to produce. And it's intended to be used in educational, art school, creative settings to workshop and talk about and invite each other to listen to our different experiences. Next slide, please. So this was A Life of Presence Like the Air, which was another piece I made as part of this project. This was funded by the Arts Council, and I produced it in 2017, working with a team of other artists and collaborators. And it was situated in Waring House, which is where you can see it now, just behind Redcliffe Roundabout. And it was also situated up in the middle of the courtyard at the Park Community Centre in Knoll. And there was another version of it without the structure at the Vestibules art space of Bristol City Council. And essentially it ran as a 40-minute listening experience for about 5 people at a time. And you sat and listened to experiences of 3 different people talk about their experiences of home, housing and family. And it was interspersed by a narrative that I wrote and read myself about the history of housing and affordable housing, and had musical inserts as well. And it was free to attend. You had to pre-book, but we also had slots open to be booked up in the day and just walked into. And in the daytime, it ran on an audio loop, so people could just come and sit and listen whenever they liked and listen to as much as they liked. And really, this was a few years before where I'm at now in my practice, and I was very interested in how, if listening, inviting people to listen together in small groups in specific locations, sort of enabled or inhibited empathy and political action on issues of economic inequality and difference. Next slide, please. Where are we? Yeah, home. Okay, cool. So this was a piece that I made just before A Life of Presence Like the Air, again in 2017. And I was given the chance to be an artist in residence at Northwest Media Centre, which was a really good experience. And I worked on their We Can Make project, which is a project that's still running as far as I'm aware. And We Can Make is looking at the viability of putting in small tiny houses in between the infill spaces of the Garden City semi-detached doubles that are really, really pervasive and commonplace up in Knoll, in Northwest. Some of the houses you can see in the background side there. So the project was looking at researching the possibility and the material practicalities of adding to the housing opportunities by having tiny houses built in between these houses. And I was brought on to interview residents of St White's Road, which is a very particular single street up behind the media centre. And I spent a lot of time door knocking and speaking to residents about what it was like to live there, their experience of living there, what they did for work, their family, aspirations, stories, and so on. And part of that research was for insights into what residents thought of the tiny house idea, but also it was useful to my work in terms of gathering content and listening to people about their everyday lives and the conditions of their everyday lives. And I worked with residents to come up with a short audio piece that was exhibited at the We Can Make exhibition at the Media Centre in May 2017. So they're the main 3 practice-based projects that I've worked on in terms of asking these questions about listening, listening to stories of everyday life as a way to sort of get insight to and invite giving an account of experiences of intersectional class identity, but also just lived experience within the arts at large. And I feel like my practice has changed shape quite significantly, and where I'm at now is I'm much more interested in coming up with sort of pedagogic workshop, practical how-to guides that invite people to give an account of themselves being listened to by others. So I don't think I'm going to be making audio recordings and audio documents as much at the moment, because I also have some problems in terms of representation, and also the audience is unable to get a sense of how these conversations have happened. Whereas if we're doing much more pedagogic inequality workshop activities, we're able to participate fully in that experience, in that listening encounter, and understand how we've ended up speaking of these experiences together. Okay, so next slide, please. So I've introduced my practice. I'm going to briefly give an overview of the sort of main related contexts of my research. So the 3 fields that I situate this question within, and that really I've kind of done a lot of reading and research into, are socially engaged art, care and listening, theories and practices of care and listening. So what is socially engaged art? With the denigration of classical and relatively modern concepts of art and aesthetics, driven in large by the ideas of the avant-garde, conceptual process art, and more recently politically and socially motivated art, has arrived a relatively new genre of art, the social turn. And this term was coined by Claire Bishop in 2006. And the social turn encompasses things like conceptual, embodied community, social, relational, and dematerialized art processes. Art processes that looks at relationships, communication, organizing sort of activist projects as the art material. It's no longer about putting a thing on a plinth or a painting on a wall or a film on a screen. I'm a big fan of socially engaged art, and I identify as being a socially engaged artist, but there are also some problems in the field that I think need address if we're going to sort of celebrate the kind of transformative potential of this field of work. So firstly, evidence suggests that to date there's been a lack of research at looking at how class origin shapes success and ability to make this kind of work. Secondly, recent research outlines that socially engaged art practices come with hidden costs, as I've said before, and I'll touch on this in my findings. And thirdly, a problem with the field is that it's often instrumentalized in maintaining the neoliberal status quo, making minor adjustments to the status quo rather than challenging and transforming it. Stephen Pritchard often states that socially engaged artists are being used to roll out aspects of neoliberal creativity fix under the guise of community art washing. Socially engaged art projects often claim to be transformative and ameliorative, but actually maintain the status quo. Nothing much really gets problematized or changed. Next slide, please. So theories and practices of care are really important to my thinking. And I look at how care is enacted or isn't enacted through socially engaged art practice, the work of others, and also my own work. Many socially engaged art practices try to seek alternative ways of relating, acting, and being together, alternatives to the ways we're encouraged to think of ourselves and relate and organise our lives, advocated under capitalist realism. In formulating the term homines curans, Joan Tronto proposes that a fairer distribution of care work is one way of advancing an alternative sort of set of values to patriarchal capitalism. And to just outline different types of care that Joan Tronto offers in theorising care that I find useful, she offers 5 dimensions of care, and I'll briefly outline them here. Caring about means that someone notices an unmet caring need. Caring for, which means that needs have been identified, someone takes responsibility to make sure these needs are met. Caregiving, kind of what it says, the act of giving care. Care receiving, the person, thing, or life form receiving care. And caring with, as a group of people defined as from family to state, relying upon a cycle of care to have their caring needs met. So I propose that the value of caring with and for others, and not only self, is that the consumer image of the body, the white male, adult, middle class, and fully able body is disrupted, decentered, and replaced with other forms of embodied lived experiences that centre care and that decouple care from being done by women and being done by people who are, you know, not properly valued in the labour economy for the type of care work that they do. And these lenses offered by Tronto also help me to analyse existing artworks through these theoretical frames to see how and if they care and if they don't. Next slide, please. So theories and practices of listening are really important in making sense of my question and where I locate my question. And this is because I'm really interested in if listening practices and methods are a form of care in themselves and are a way to invite us all to give an account of our different experiences of privilege and inequality together, working together in situ. So in his paper, Tomb, Temple, Machine and Self, The Social Construction of the Body, academic Anthony Sincott argues that human history can be seen as a shift from olfactory to oral, those two terms sound very similar to me, to vision. In this sensory account of ancient through to modern, the ways in which reality was perceived and experimented differed wildly, depending on which senses were most used to function in, reflect on and act in the world. I think still in contemporary Western culture, ocular centricity, the eye, reigns supreme. However, as sensory study researchers and sound artists and theorists will attest, ways of listening are equally important as ways of seeing and coming to better understand how we communicate, interpret and act in the world. The world is not just seen with and through the eye, it is heard and listened to and encountered through the ear and the vibrating, sensing, sensual listening body. I have a lot of ideas on theories of listening that we hopefully can talk about in the Q&A. And while this is a less than straightforward exchange, wrought with potential problematic power dynamics, in certain cases, I think listening practices can offer a connecting and convivial social encounter. And I explore the potential and effects of convivial listening through my praxis and discuss the value of these when I move into my findings. Next slide, which is now my findings. Okay, so I found 3 clusters of findings from undertaking this research, and they speak to my methodology. So I have findings that fall under sort of more traditional academic research, secondary findings, findings from existing literature, and I've also got findings that arise from my own primary research, interviewing audiences that have experienced my work, and I see these as practice-based findings, and I've got findings arising from kind of reflecting on my own practice, but I'll talk about these briefly now. So the 3 main findings arising from a kind of identification and analysis of literature is that firstly, there is established research into workforce inequality and the causes of it in the creative and cultural industries. And this can be seen in reports such as Panic, It's an Arts Emergency, and Getting In and Getting On, Class Participation and Job Equality in the UK's creative industries. However, there has been a lack of research done into workforce inequality within the sector of socially engaged art in the UK. This is really important, and I think this research needs further address. Secondly, one of the reasons I think that socially engaged art as a sector of the creative and cultural industries are relatively under-researched in terms of who gets to work in this area are because this term is often invisible in current definitions of creative and cultural industries. There are 9 sectors that comprise the creative and cultural industries, and the ones including visual arts, performing arts and music, which is where I would imagine dematerialized art practices being discussed, it's not really discussed. So there's actually an invisibility of this area of practice at the moment in a lot of leading literature. Thirdly, socially engaged art practices are chronically underfunded, with socially engaged artists routinely doing more work than they're paid for. Sophie Hope and Eleanor Balfouri look at this, and an important paper that gives insight into this is Who Cares at What Price? The Hidden Costs of Socially Engaged Arts Labour and the Moral Failure of Cultural Policy by Eleanor Balfouri, out earlier this year, looks at how socially engaged artists frequently shoulder all sorts of different hidden costs that they're not remunerated for. And what this means is that socially engaged artists are working harder and experiencing more pressures than are adequately sort of paid for and valued in the doing of their work. Practice-based findings are also 3. So these are findings that I have identified through really reflecting on and critically interrogating the work that I've done, the artistic work that I've done as part of this project. So firstly, I propose that theories and practices of care are an approach that we might use in better understanding class inequality in the field of socially engaged art. Secondly, I propose that convivial listening as a method is one way that we can do this work and respond to the lack of research done into class origins shaping success as an artist working in the field of socially engaged art. And I call this convivial listening, and I present it as a method as well as a metaphor describing how we might actually spend time together giving voice to our experiences and how our experience relates to our ability and our desire to work as an artist. Thirdly, this is a finding really for me as an artist, is I found auto theory a really useful method in terms of giving me a method to speak of my own lived experience. And I think this is valuable and important. I've often made work about other people, and through this PhD, I've felt like I found a method to speak of some aspects of my own lived experiences that I previously found very difficult or emotional or challenging to speak about. And I think that's a valuable use. And I'm drawing on the feminist practice of auto-theorization, which I can talk about later. Okay, so findings arising from primary research, research done with my 30 audience members who were sitting and listening together in different parts of Bristol to a live presence like the air, are really fourfold. And I found through close analysis of transcribed audience feedback to their experience of this work was that listening, situated site-specific listening, for many people was new and unusual and sometimes uncomfortable. Listening can, but doesn't always, prompt self-consciousness and self-reflection in those experiencing the listening. And listening for some audiences was empathetic and caring. And finally, listening in situ in particular locations, which Home and A Life Presence the Air was doing, creates listening experiences enmeshed with auditory reality of sight, society, and things happening within that physical geography. So I'm just coming on to my conclusion now. So basically, what we found here, well, what I found here is that socially engaged arts and the creative and cultural industries are not accessible to all. And some people will be better resourced, structurally advantaged and able to dream of being, let alone having success working as a socially engaged artist. And this is true in other sectors of the creative and cultural industries as well. If we are to see different stories played out in the world and ones that acknowledge and take aim at structural inequality endemic to capitalist realism, then we need to make changes to the ways in which we train, organise and kind of enact creative and cultural labour. The responsibility to challenge these inequality issues, social and creative justice issues, are not the responsibility of us as individuals. It's a responsibility of policymakers, educational institutions, public funding bodies, commissioners, curators, think tanks, many parts of the branches of the tree of the creative and cultural industries. And hopefully we can work on addressing this together. And I think we all need to care for and care about challenging the long, cruel shadow of capitalist values, aspiration policies and social structures. So I'm just going to return to my question to close. Can listening practices help understand how class background shapes creative ideas and experiences of success when working as a socially engaged artist? I think yes. In developing the convivial listening protocol, first-person voices and their articulation are prioritised, and they're done so together. And so too are a range of practices that quite literally invite people to reflect on and give voice to their own experience of privilege and inequality. And I'd really love to trial the convivial listening protocol with any of you who are interested. And the value of care-infused, listening-led, socially engaged art practices are significant. In developing socially engaged art practices that set out to make space to work with and listen to excluded voices, it becomes possible to A, challenge the crisis of participation. Socially engaged art, like many of the creative cultural industries, are still not demonstrating workforce diversity. B, it becomes possible to challenge the crisis of knowledge. In listening to lived experiences of inequality and privilege, we come to better understand how class shapes success, and this addresses some existing knowledge gaps. C, we get to challenge the crisis of criticism. The UK-based socially engaged art sector still hasn't been adequately scrutinised in how it does or doesn't reproduce the privilege endemic to certain individuals and class and race backgrounds over others. So I propose that part of the collective struggle can be realised through critical artistic praxis that cares to listen to and with others, to and with difference. And in doing so, we may understand that our struggles are different, but holding space for diversity and difference, it is possible to explore ways to challenge the status quo, build world beneath worlds, tell and make new stories, co-create new relationships, new forms of artistic expression and messy togetherness. And I'm going to close with a quote from Bell Hooks, and then we'll have some time for questions. So this is Bell Hooks speaking, quote, "Let me begin by saying that I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing," close quote. And that's it. I really look forward to your questions and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Catty. Sorry, Catlin. We're way back. I mean, you made a technically imperfect setup all the more perfect for the talk. I'm sure there are questions. Anybody in the room like to kick us off? Okay, I'm going to walk over to Alec.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, there's a bit of reverb, isn't there, in the room? Okay.
Oh, should I mute myself?
Yes. Oh, no, it doesn't affect at all. Okay. So here's
Right,
my
okay.
question. How can you prepare people to be better listeners?
That is such a good question. Thank you. Yeah, so what I'll say to that is I've thought and learnt a lot about listening through drawing on a couple of people's practice in listening. And one of those people is a woman called Pauline Oliveros, who's dead now, but she coined the term deep listening. And in her book, this book by the same title, she's literally about 41 listening activities that you can do. And a lot of them are doing them with other people. So she starts with like a listening meditation, which I actually am thinking about incorporating into future workshops. And that's about 5 minutes where you just sit by yourself. You could be in a group or by yourself. And you just really tune, you just pay attention to the global and local sounds that you hear, but also how your body feels. So I find a lot of Pauline Oliveros' listening activities really useful, practical things to do. And then the other thing I'm trying to be pragmatic, not theoretical here, is last year I did a co-counselling training, which is essentially a co-counselling practice where counselling is free and anyone can do it together for free once you've done the training, which is not free, but it's about 100 quid. And the first principle is that you agree the time that you listen to the other, and you only make agreed interventions through that listening period. So you just sit and listen to someone for 30 minutes or 20 minutes, and you offer certain interventions to help that person say what they need to say, articulate themselves. And I find that very useful as well. And then more generally, I think it's that thing of wanting to be restrained in response. When we're listening, is we all want to say things. We've got things coming up like, oh my God, yeah, I want to say that, or makes me feel this, and just to sort of restrain that for a bit. So yeah, I'd suggest Pauline Oliveros, co-counselling, and sort of slowing down and trying to dampen our desire to respond initially. But yeah, they're my initial thoughts. Thank you for that question.
We definitely want to get you in to do the convivial listening protocol at some point. If you want to do some testing, come and hang out. Jade, any questions from YouTube? Nothing yet? Anything from the room? If it's on the edge of your tongue, now is the time to say it. Don't be scared. Okay, I'm going to dive in one while we wait for a question from the chat then. What do you think of the politics of the term underrepresented?
Oh, God. That's a really tricky question. Underrepresented. Okay, that's a good question. I need to think about the response to that. So I think things like protected characteristics, class, race, age, gender, health, ableism are really useful criteria with which to think about difference, and also to measure and understand difference in certain occupations, which is obviously part of the thrust of my own thinking, who gets to work in socially engaged art, who doesn't. And I think representation, for me, that question depends, like, what do we mean by that? Do we mean what kind of groups are being represented within a workforce, or what kind of stories are being represented within a media or a medium, film, VR, audio work, whatever. So I guess, yeah, I'm kind of not sure if it's that or that, but I'll speak to what I think it is. I think like how many people from different groups are being represented within creative and cultural industries. And I think what I'd say is it's more about, for me, I'm more interested in participation, access and validation. So like who gets to participate in creative production? What are the barriers to access, and what can we do to address those in terms of career progression, in terms of validation gaps, in terms of insecure employment contracts, insecure working conditions, quite endemic to the creative industries, and how might we enable easier access to participate and create ideas and stories told through the arts. Because I think what's very important is that, creative industries, from film through to literature, through to new media, through to fine art, help us imagine new worlds and tell new stories. So it's very important that we have diverse people telling these stories. So yeah, I think my answer to that, Luke, would be I'd like more detail on what that representation refers to, and I think I'm more interested in participation sort of overcoming barriers to entry as a worker than to issues of representation. But that's a bit on the fly, so that's my caveat.
I know it was a tough question, thanks. Any other questions from the room?
It's me. Hi, Caitlin. It's Mandy. Hi, Mandy Rose. So congratulations on the work. It's really thought-provoking and important. So I was kind of musing on the few things I've come across that socially engaged art that was about listening. And I was thinking of Suzanne Lacey's The Roof is on Fire, which, for those, you're nodding, so you know it. So I was just wondering if you'd come across research on that project or anything similar. I guess there aren't probably that many examples, but super interested in that one. For those that perhaps you can tell the room what it is. Well, I'll just say a piece in a parking garage in I think not in San Francisco, across the bay. I can't think of what the neighborhood's called, but anyway, where young people were in cars talking, and the audience came through and just was invited to listen to those young people. So yeah, anyway, over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you for that. That's a great question. And Suzanne Lacey does show up in my context chapter quite a bit, as does that piece of work. And yeah, The Roof is on Fire, it was in Oakland, just across the bay from San Francisco. And Suzanne Lacey is like a contemporary socially engaged artist, and she's an American white woman, and I think she's in her 60s now. She's been practicing for quite a long time and does a lot of like conversational installations and talking experiences in a whole range of different contexts. But this piece, The Roof is on Fire, was preceded by Suzanne and 3 other artists going and working with high school students in the local school and asking mixed race students, but with quite a focus on a lot of African American young students. And they asked and workshopped the students what they felt about policing and also technology and new media and the ways in which they're being educated. And they actually got the police in to hear from the students in an educational setting what the students felt of the local policing methods and tactics. So that was very interesting for me, that they preceded the performance of the piece, which, as Mandy said, was this big, it's amazing, the pictures are amazing. It's like this rooftop car park on a high rise with about 100 cars filled with kids, and the kids are the center of the piece, and the audience walks around and listens to the young people talking about all sorts of issues to do with power, let's say, education, access, the police, job opportunities, their experiences of race and class, and so on. And you walk around and listen to them. But the interesting thing for me, that this piece was preceded by a lot of pedagogic intervention, workshopping in schools, bringing in like film, cameras for the kids to go and film their experience, and conversational workshops between otherwise perhaps antagonistic actors. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting piece. And I think, Mandy, what springs to mind as you share that is, the I still reigns supreme, and a lot of socially engaged art, like other practices, still wants to create a spectacle and a thing to look at. And I'm much more interested in how to facilitate spaces to engage in auditory listening experiences to people giving an account of their lived experience, giving voice to themselves. And I'll just share a couple of artists that I think do this same kind of work, because it's really useful to signpost. So one of them is Cassie Thornton and the project The Hologram. And another artist I really like is a non-binary person called Jana Hedver, who's based in Berlin and LA. And they have got a theory I really take value in called sick woman theory. And it looks at how art can respond to the presence and the pain and the messiness of non-successful or non-conforming bodies. So it focuses on the presence of the body. And I am also really interested in how we give voice to our physical experiences of inequality. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caitlin. I think we're going to have to draw to a close there. So I just want to ask for a big in the building thank you to Caitlin before she disappears. Thank you, mate.
much for having me. I've it's quite a lot to cover there, but I've really enjoyed this. So thank you for having me, and big ups to Pervasive Media Studio generally as well.
Okay. So the talk is online if you want to catch it again or pick up on anything that Caitlin talked about there. Before you leave us, online and in the building, next week's talk is called Live Illustration Expanded. It's from studio resident Camille Aubrey, and she's going to introduce the R&D project Live Illustration Expanded and explore how live illustration can transform physical and virtual environments and be a performance in itself. You can get news on all our talks on our Twitter feed, our Instagram feed, or by joining our newsletter. And if you're watching, hit subscribe. Please don't go before you do that. I want to say a massive thank you for those of you who did come in today. It is a real pleasure and a very heartening experience to see physical bodies in the space who aren't here on a day-to-day basis. So that's great. And thank you to those of you who joined us online. We'll see you all same time, same place next week.